The moment a mother puts down a prepared script and speaks the truth instead, you are watching something that almost never happens inside that building. And when it does, it means something has already broken that no amount of careful language was ever going to fix. Catherine sat in front of a camera last week and did something that the palace has spent over a decade making structurally impossible. She had notes. The communications team had prepared them, the way they prepare everything, smoothed and cleared and vetted until every word in it could survive being printed on a front page for the wrong reasons. She looked at those notes, she picked them up, and then she put them face down on the table beside her and spoke about her youngest son in her own voice, without clearance, without advance notice, and without telling a single person inside that building that she was going to. She cried approximately 2/3 of the way through. Not at the beginning, where you might expect it, and not at the end, where it would read as relief. In the middle, on a sentence about Louis, and she kept talking through it rather than stopping, which is somehow more difficult to watch than a complete breakdown would have been. Because stopping says, I cannot do this. Carrying on says, I am doing this, and I know exactly what it is costing me. The palace does not do unscripted. Kensington does not do tears in public that nobody has signed off on in advance. Every image, every appearance, every carefully timed release of a photograph, taken on her own camera by her own hand, all of it engineered, cleared, and delivered with the precision of an institution that has been managing its own narrative since before any of the people currently running it were born. That is not cynicism. That is the actual policy, and it has been the actual policy for over a decade, and it was working right up until the moment it stopped. The question that matters is not what she said. The question is, what pushed a woman that disciplined into saying it at all? Because something had been building in that family for months, and the country had noticed the shape of it without being able to name it. Engagements canceled without explanation. Schedules shifting at short notice. A boy who simply was not appearing anywhere, and a press office that answered every question about the youngest Wales child with 4 polite words about family privacy. That silence was not an accident. William built it. He argued for it from the beginning, and he defended it for years, and then it collapsed on him in the one way nobody inside that building had modeled for. And I will get to exactly how that happened, and it is not what you are expecting. If you are new here, my name is Harold. I go through everything that moves around this family, the records, the timelines, the stories that went quiet before anybody finished asking questions, and I put the pieces together the way I read them. Stay with me to the end, because this story lands on a conversation between a father and an 8-year-old boy sitting on the floor of a garden room, and that conversation is the reason any of the rest of it matters. Start with the policy, because the policy is the foundation of everything. George was born in 2013. Within a year of that, William and Catherine had settled on an approach to their children that did not move for a decade. The framing, from actual reporting rather than from me, was a 10-year plan to let those children lead normal lives. A decade of deliberate decisions about where those kids appear, how often, at what age, and in whose company, and the results of it have been in front of you your entire life without you fully registering them. 3 children, who appear publicly, perhaps a handful of times a year. Christmas at Sandringham, a balcony on a specific occasion, a carefully chosen sporting event. Photographs released by their own mother, rather than taken by anyone else, on her own camera, on her own timing. Because a photograph you release is a photograph nobody can sell. That is the machine William built. And he built it for a reason that has nothing to do with modern communication strategy and everything to do with a Saturday in September of 1997. He was 15 years old. He walked behind his mother's coffin through the streets of London in a dark suit while the entire world watched him do it. And inside a fortnight, every private thing Diana had ever owned became public property. Her letters, her handwriting, her voice on tapes she never intended anyone to hear, her clothes sold and catalogued and displayed. William learned at 15 exactly what this institution does with a royal life once it gets its hands on the details. He has spent nearly 30 years since then making sure it never gets its hands on his children. Every closed door in this story starts there. Hold on to that, because by the end of this, that same instinct turns all the way around on him. Now. The last several months are where the policy stopped working. Louis is 8 years old. He is the youngest of the 3, which in that family means he has the least defined role and the most protection built around him. And both of those things have been true his entire life. George is 13 and has a future that everyone can describe. Charlotte is 11 and has a public presence she has been growing into since she could walk. Louis has been the one they kept back. For a significant stretch earlier this year, he was kept back completely. Appearances that had been penciled in quietly came off the schedule. 2 family events he had attended in previous years went ahead without him. The pattern held long enough that the people who follow this family closely started counting the months, and the counting produced exactly the sort of speculation the policy exists to prevent. Which is the first irony in a story that turns out to be full of them. I want to be fair to the policy before we watch it fail, because it worked for a decade and almost nobody gives it credit for that. Those 3 children have grown up with something no royal child before them had. George got to be 9 years old in public, approximately 4 times. Charlotte has never had a school photograph sold to a newspaper. Nobody holds a long-lens photograph of any of them crying or falling or having the sort of afternoon every child has, and no child should have to see printed and sold. Compare that to what William and Harry were by the age of 8, which was a running feature in the national press, with photographers stationed outside the school gates as a matter of routine. William built that protection deliberately, against considerable pressure, and it is probably the single most successful thing he has done in his working life. Hold that in your head, because the reason this story hurts is that the thing which failed was not a mistake, it was his best work. The turning point happened at Windsor during a private rehearsal, and it is the moment Catherine later described as the point where she stopped being able to hold the line. The rehearsal was supposed to be gentle, a practice run before a formal appearance, in a room with no crowds and no cameras, so that Louis could work out how to stand and where to walk without an audience learning anything about how it went. Halfway through the morning, he stopped. He reached for his mother's hand. And he asked her whether he was allowed to be seen. Not whether he wanted to go, whether he was allowed. Catherine knelt down and took both his hands, and she has told at least 2 people since that she could not find a single sentence to say back to him that was both true and reassuring at the same time. William cleared the room of everyone except the household staff who had to remain, and had George and Charlotte taken to another part of the residence. He did not want either of them to see their brother asking that question. That morning changed the temperature inside that household completely. Everything that followed is the story of people reacting to it. William's response was to shut everything down. He suspended every engagement involving Louis with immediate effect, and made it clear he was not interested in discussing it. One missed ceremony, he said, mattered less than nothing next to a child who had begun to wonder whether there was a reason he was being kept away. And honestly, it is hard to argue with the instinct. It is also the exact moment the whole thing began to come apart. Senior aides warned him that repeated unexplained absences would attract questions. And I should explain the word here, because it does real work in that building. An engagement in royal terms is an official duty or public appearance carried out on behalf of the monarchy. The entire visible life of that institution is built out of them. They are scheduled months ahead, they are logged, they are published, and when a member of that family stops appearing at them, the absence is a matter of record rather than gossip. You do not need a source inside the palace to notice. You need a diary. The advisors wanted a controlled explanation released before speculation filled the gap. Something short, something vague, something that would let the press office answer questions with a document rather than a shrug. And the aides were not being cynical, which is the part people always get wrong about that job. Their entire function is to look 18 months ahead and work out which silence is going to become a story. They had seen this exact shape before. In 2024, a gap in Catherine's own public schedule and a refusal to explain it produced several months of speculation that went to places nobody could have predicted and did real damage to a real person before the palace finally said what was going on. They were not asking William to expose his son. They were telling him that an unexplained absence does not stay empty, that somebody always fills it, and that he would not get to choose who. William refused, flatly, repeatedly, and for months. He would not allow his son's situation to become a public narrative while the child was still uncertain and frightened. And he had 30 years of personal evidence for why that mattered. He was right about the danger, He was wrong about the solution. And the gap between those two things is this entire story. Because the silence did not stay contained around Lewis. It spread through that house, and it got into the other two children, and neither parent saw it happening until it was well established. George is 13, which is old enough to understand that something is wrong, and young enough to think it is his job to absorb it. He decided that calmness was expected of him. He got quieter, more careful, more useful around the house. And both his parents read that as him coping well, because that is exactly what it looks like from the outside. Then one night he asked his father whether a younger brother could be kept out of everything without anybody outside the family knowing. Sit with that question for a moment, because it is not a question about protocol. He was asking whether the silence meant something bad. He was 13 years old, working out on his own that his family had stopped explaining things, and trying to establish whether the not explaining was the ordinary kind or the frightening kind. Charlotte went the other way entirely. She is 11, and she noticed every closed door, every conversation that changed direction when she came into a room, every lowered voice, every adult who suddenly had somewhere else to be. Nobody sat her down and told her anything. She assembled a fairly accurate picture anyway, because 11-year-olds always do, and adults never believe it. And she did something with what she had assembled that I keep returning to. She started leaving handwritten jokes beside her brother's bed. Not once. Regularly, as a system. She had worked out on her own that when Lewis laughed, he came back for a minute, and she went about producing that on purpose, in pencil, without telling anyone she was doing it. And later, when she overheard staff discussing the attention the family was beginning to attract outside the gates, she went and found her mother and asked 2 questions, one after the other. She asked whether strangers were worried about her brother, and then she asked whether Lewis was going to have to answer them all. An 11-year-old should not be running that calculation. She ran it anyway, because nobody had given her anything else to work with. I am going to hold the most important scene in this story for a while yet, because it happens between William and his son on a floor, and if I give it to you now, it is just a man and a boy sitting down together, and you will not understand why it turned a future king inside out. It is coming. Everything between here and there is the reason it lands. Catherine was carrying something different from either of them, and she was carrying it alone. She was sitting with Charlotte explaining that these things sometimes move slowly, while getting almost no sleep herself. She was keeping her worst thoughts away from William to protect him. He was doing exactly the same thing back at her for exactly the same reason, and neither of them had noticed that they had both stopped saying anything real. That is what long strain does to two people who love each other and are both trying to be the strong one. Nothing breaks. There is no argument, no coldness, nothing you could point at and say, that is the moment it went wrong. The kindness just goes quiet and stays quiet. And after a few months you are two people running parallel operations in the same house, and the silence between you feels like composure, but it is not composure. It is just silence. And Lewis was sitting in the middle of it. 8 years old. Too young to know a single thing about how the institution he was born into actually works, and old enough to read a room full of adults perfectly. Anybody who has watched this family in public over the past 6 years knows exactly who he is. He is the one who cannot sit still through a ceremony, the one whose face ends up on the front pages doing something his grandmother would have raised an eyebrow at. Questions, noise, sudden energy. An ongoing negotiation with his mother about whether he has to stand up now. Being the youngest of 3 in that family means fewer expectations landing on you, and it also means you are the least explained person in the building. George's future gets discussed. Charlotte's role gets discussed. Lewis has been allowed to just be a child, which is the kindest thing they could have done for him, and which left him with no framework at all for understanding why he had suddenly stopped going anywhere. The house got quieter around him. That is the part he actually noticed. Not a decision, not a conversation, just adults adjusting their volume. All of that leads to the night this whole thing broke open. It broke open between the two of them, after the children had gone to bed. Catherine had written her own statement by hand, on paper, over several sittings. She put those pages down on the table in front of her husband, and let him read them. The palace draft was sitting right beside them. If the term is unfamiliar, a palace-approved statement is wording that royal advisors have cleared before public release, and its purpose is to say something without creating anything new for anybody to ask about. It is a genuinely skilled piece of work. Every clause has been checked against what it might mean in 6 months. To Catherine, those sentences were empty. They described a situation without admitting there had been any fear in it. They mentioned things improving without saying a word about what the family had actually lived through. They were, in the precise sense, unfalsifiable, and that is what she could not stand about them. William read the opening line of her version and shook his head before he reached the second. He told her that one public message can be replayed, analyzed, and quoted back at that boy for the rest of his life. He asked her whether she was ready to watch their son discussed by people who have never met him and never will. And his voice went up, and then it stopped mid-sentence. Because both of them understood at the same moment that the anger was fear wearing a coat. Catherine did not back off. What she said next is the thing this entire piece exists to tell you. She told him that Louis had begun to believe he was being kept out of sight because the family was ashamed of him. Read that again. Not because he was ill, not because anything was wrong with him. Because he had worked out at 8 years old that he was the one who did not get to go, that nobody would tell him why, and that when he came into a room, the conversation changed. A child given no explanation will build one, and the one he built was that he was the problem. That is what a decade of careful protection had produced inside the head of the person it was designed to protect. She pushed the official draft away from her, across the table, and told William there was nothing in it that resembled the boy they had nearly watched stop believing in himself. She pointed out that George and Charlotte had both learned to lower their voices whenever their brother came up, that their eldest was watching every closed door in the building, that their daughter was leaving handwritten jokes on a bed because she had worked out on her own that laughter brought her brother back. The silence had stopped protecting one child. It was shaping all three. And then she told him the thing that finished the argument, because it had not come from her at all. Louis had made a request, unprompted, to his mother, and he had thought about it beforehand. He wanted to thank the people who had made him feel safe. He wanted George and Charlotte to know that what they had done had mattered to him. And more than either of those things, he did not want people thinking he had disappeared because he was not brave enough. William sat down. He put his hands over his face for a moment. And then he said something that I think is remarkable, coming from a man raised from birth to maintain composure in public. He admitted that his decisions had not only been about privacy, they had also been about his own fear of losing control of what happens to the people he loves. That is the most honest sentence anybody in that family has produced in years, and it explains everything he has done since 1997 in a single line. They reached an agreement together that night. Catherine could speak. She would keep the private details private. And she would stop pretending the last several months had been easy. One person could still stop the whole thing, and he is the one person in that family who has been in exactly this position himself. Charles received the draft after an evening briefing. The first thing he did was clear the room. He read the pages twice, and when he reached the line about a child mistaking privacy for shame, he took his glasses off and put them down on the desk and did not pick them up again for a while. Understand why that line landed on that particular man. Charles has spent his entire life inside an institution that teaches restraint before anyone is old enough to understand what restraint costs. He was taught it. He taught it to his own sons, and one of those sons has spent 20 years telling anyone who will listen how much damage it did. In February 2024, Buckingham Palace announced that Charles had been diagnosed with cancer. He has spent the 2.5 years since then working out in public exactly how much of his own situation the country is entitled to know. He is not reading that sentence as a grandfather. He is reading it as someone who has been the subject of the same argument. William arrived shortly afterwards, and Charles asked him one question. He asked whether the statement actually served Louis or whether it just made the adults around him feel better. That is a brutal question, and it is the correct one. Every family in this situation tells itself it is protecting the child. A fair proportion of the time, it is protecting itself from having to say difficult things out loud, and the child absorbs the difference immediately. William defended his wife's judgment. He also admitted the thing he had been holding since the beginning, which is that the moment a recording exists, the family stops controlling the story. Reporters would go back through the absences. They would question the decisions. They would go looking for everything the family had deliberately left out, and they would find some of it. He was right about that too. Incidentally, all of it happened. The communications team had prepared a safer version by then, shorter and calmer, and it had removed the part where Louis thanks the people who helped him. They had taken out the only line in the entire document that belonged to the child. Charles rejected it. His reasoning, according to someone who saw the exchange, was that a statement stripped of the boy's own meaning would protect the institution while failing the person standing at the center of it, and that this was the exact trade the monarchy had spent a century making badly. He approved Catherine's version on one condition, and the condition is, the thing I would put on the front of a newspaper if I ran one. Louis had to hear every word before it was released. Not a summary, not the gist. The whole thing, read to him, so that he understood precisely what the country was about to be told about him, and had the chance to say no. Think carefully about how rare that is. An 8-year-old given an actual veto over a royal statement about his own life, by the king, in writing. Catherine read him the final version in private. He listened to the whole thing with a seriousness she had not seen from him before, and when she finished, he corrected exactly one phrase. She had written that he was doing better. He did not want that. He told her he wanted people to know he was getting strong again. She changed the sentence on the spot. Sit with the difference between those two things, because an 8-year-old found it, and a room full of professional communicators did not. Doing better is something that happens to you. Getting strong again is something you are doing. One describes a patient, the other describes a person with a job to do and every intention of finishing it. He heard the passive voice, and he rejected it. And he did it without any of the vocabulary anyone would use to explain why. Charles approved the revised wording with a note in his own handwriting. It said that truth delivered with restraint could protect the crown more honestly than silence. That note is the closest thing this story has to a hinge, because it reverses something that institution has believed since before any of these people were born. The default has always been that saying nothing is the safe option. Charles put it in writing in his own hand that in this case, the safe option was the dangerous one. The recording went out. Catherine spoke calmly, thanked the people who had cared for her son, and said his strength was coming back. 2/3 of the way through, she cried and carried on, and the palace did not cut it. The response was immediate and considerably larger than anyone had prepared for. Headlines within the hour, messages arriving at the palace faster than anyone could process them. And then the coverage turned. It turned in exactly the direction William had spent months warning everyone it would. Broadcasters started building timelines. Somebody in a graphics department pulled every appearance Louis had made in the previous 18 months and laid them against the dates of the ones he had missed. By the second evening, that chart was running on 3 different channels. Old family footage went up beside the new statement. Presenters started using the phrase in recent months in the particular tone that signals, "We are about to speculate." Then one commentator did the thing that ended it for William. He was reviewing footage taken well before any of this had started. Ordinary footage, a family walking somewhere, and he paused it on the boy's face and began going through the child's expression frame by frame, on air, telling an audience what a 7-year-old had or had not been feeling on an afternoon 2 summers ago. William was watching it. He got up out of his chair, put his hand out toward the screen as if he could stop the man physically, and then he found the remote and turned the television off in the middle of the sentence, and he said one thing to the 2 or 3 people in that room. And everybody who was in it has repeated it since. My son is not entertainment. 5 words, from a man who had spent his entire adult life refusing to say anything at all about his children in public. Not a statement. Not a line cleared by anyone. No press office within a mile of it. A father standing in his own sitting room with his hands still half raised toward a blank screen, telling a room full of staff exactly what he thought of what he had just watched. Hold that image. Because it is the whole argument in one frame. A man who spent 30 years building a wall around his children, sitting in his own house, watching a stranger freeze-frame his 8-year-old's face and narrate it to the nation. Everything he had been afraid of. On his own screen. 4 days after he had agreed to let his wife speak, he had been right. That is the uncomfortable part of this story that most of the subsequent coverage skipped straight past. William was right about what would happen. He was just wrong about what the alternative was costing. But something else was happening outside the gates that week, and it is the reason this story ended up reaching people who have no particular connection to this family at all. Families started leaving handwritten blue stars outside Windsor Castle. Paper, cardboard, whatever was to hand. Blue because that was the color that had circulated, and each one carrying the same 3 words the boy had chosen for himself. Getting strong again. They multiplied along the public barrier over approximately 4 days, and most of them were not addressed to Lewis. Most of them were addressed to someone else. A child in a hospital in Leeds, a grandson recovering from something, a daughter who had been having a difficult year, written by people who had come to Windsor to leave something for a prince and ended up leaving a message for their own. That castle has seen a great deal across the centuries. Celebration, mourning, national uncertainty, the whole catalog. And this country has a specific and complicated history with leaving things at royal gates, because the last time it happened on that scale was 1997, when the flowers went 10 feet deep outside Kensington, and the message underneath them was accusation. The nation stood at those gates and told that family it had got a child's grief wrong. 29 years later, the same country stood at a different gate and left paper stars for a boy it was worried about. Nobody planned the symmetry. William, of all people, would have noticed it. A newspaper ran Catherine's face across its front page under 3 words, a mother's voice. Underneath, in smaller print, it repeated the phrase Louis had insisted on. That front page did something the palace could not have engineered. It did not present the boy as fragile or damaged. It presented what he was doing as courage, and it put a mother's honesty above the institution's polish. On the same day, several other outlets were running the frame-by-frame footage. Not everyone went that way. The pushback was real. Commentators wanted to know why the palace had stayed silent for months. They wanted the earlier absences explained. Some made the argument, and it is not a stupid argument, that a family funded by the public cannot decide unilaterally which parts of its working life are private. Palace officials answered harder than they usually answer anything. A child's situation, they said, is not public property. The family had said enough to acknowledge what had happened without handing over every detail of it. When one phrase from the recording started generating serious speculation, the phrase about the moment they had feared things were moving in the wrong direction, the advisors came back and recommended a second clarification. Get ahead of it. 3 more sentences. Close the gap before it grows. Catherine refused. She said that explaining every frightening detail would destroy the exact privacy she had spent months protecting, and that she had not gone through all of this in order to end up doing the thing she had refused to do at the start. That is the line where she wins the argument she had been having with that building since the first draft landed. She had proved she was willing to speak. Now she proved she was willing to stop, and those 2 things together are what made the whole thing hold. Now, the garden room. The real turning point in this story never happened in front of a camera. It happened in a garden room, on the floor, and nobody outside that house knew about it for weeks. A few days after the recording went out, William went looking for his son and found him sitting on his own. No doctors, no siblings, no staff, no protective adults arranging anything. A boy in a quiet room. There was a chair right next to him. William ignored it and sat down on the floor, so that he was level with the child rather than above him. Then he asked one question. He asked Louis how he felt now that people knew. Louis took a while to answer, and what he said first was not about the statement or the public or any of the things his parents had spent months agonizing over. He said he had noticed that his father had stopped talking about royal events whenever he came into the room. Follow what that means.